Welcome to a fantastic edition of Rebellion's educational series. We'll learn about real estate with one of the hottest young stars in New York City real estate, the CEO of Urban Standard Capital, Seth Weissman, friend of mine nearly 20 years, Wharton, Goldman Sachs, Perry Capital, as bright as they come in New York. The man develops, he lends, he acquires, he does everything. Seth, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you, Alex, for having me. It's a lot of fun to spend time with you always, and I look forward to a lively discussion.
I know you were an equity investor from your time at Goldman Sachs, but how did you get into debt investing?
Sure. So when I was at Perry Capital, I worked on both debt and equity investments, and we were the capital behind a couple bridge lenders, one in South Florida and one on the West Coast. And so I actually split my time between debt investing and equity investing, primarily in the New York City marketplace.
Do you think the Florida run-up will continue? Would you buy a house in the Gulf Coast right now?
You know, it's not a market that we follow that closely, although we've actually started to look into expanding our lending operations into South Florida and actually quoted our first loan in Delray yesterday. I think the fundamentals are there. I think Florida has taken a pro-growth approach. The elected officials there have sort of, hung the flag, hung the banner that we're open for business, which is the opposite approach that New York elected officials have taken. And as a result, taxpayers and businesses are leaving New York for states like Florida. And I think as long as that trend continues, it's a good sign for the long-term fundamentals of Florida.
Do you see that trend abating anytime soon? I mean, the exodus from New York?
I think that the elected leadership in New York needs to show actual leadership. What we've seen in the last 5 years has been a lot of grandstanding and rhetoric that has been very divisive and has chased businesses out of New York. The loss of Amazon is not a win for New Yorkers, even pre-COVID, but certainly seeing what happened with COVID. Can you imagine how nice it would be to have Amazon investing billions of dollars into New York right now, one of the companies that has thrived during this pandemic? I think it's a lesson learned for a lot of elected officials, but I hope they can rise above the sort of rhetoric and the politics and take more of a centrist, economic-minded approach. That can still be a fair approach, that can be inclusive and allow New Yorkers from all walks of life to have a better life, fairer wages, et cetera. But you need to include the business community. They need to include the real estate community. These are the drivers of the tax revenue. And when you spurn an industry like real estate that provides over 60% of the budget for New York City, that's a recipe for disaster. And I think that with the current budget shortfalls, it's a big wake-up call to a lot of elected officials that they have to change their tune.
Wow. So when you're lending, what type of rates are you looking for? 15%, 20%, 10%? How expensive are real estate loans these days?
Sure. So what we focus on are what are considered bridge loans. So they're transitional loans in nature, meaning that the underlying properties are in the middle of some type of business plan. It could be a lease up, it could be a renovation, rehab, something where they're taking a property from point A to point sort of C, and at C they're going to be able to qualify for conventional financing that will could be agency, it could be conventional bank debt. But our loans are transitional, so they're a little bit riskier in nature. We typically charge in the 8 to 9% range for senior loans. For second position loans, they typically are in the 12 to 14% range. Our gross return targets are 15 to 18% on our debt fund, which we've been able to hit consistently.
Wow, very impressive. Seth, I was talking to my old friend Harry Lafrac yesterday, and he was wondering, do we think the outer boroughs will ever rival Manhattan from a luxury perspective?
Sure, it's a great question. I think you're seeing that. I mean, right now, if you look at the market dynamics in New York City, Manhattan has been hit the hardest, mostly luxury Manhattan. Markets like Brooklyn and parts of Queens are continuing to do quite well. I mean, on the equity side of our business, we recently listed a gut renovated townhouse that we had bought in bankruptcy a couple years ago. We put it on the market and we had 3 offers in the first week. 2 were at ask and it went into contract over ask. So, the pricing is pretty similar to where it was pre-COVID, particularly for quality product.
What about Queens? Do you have a view on Queens?
I think certain submarkets of Queens have a similar dynamic. Looking at neighborhoods like Astoria, Sunnyside, Forest Hills, Long Island City at the moment has just a tremendous amount of supply, so has been hit sort of hard. Additionally, the loss of an anchor tenant like Amazon was supposed to be is a negative, but where I think Brooklyn outperforms and maybe parts of Queens like at Forest Hills or Sunnyside and parts of Astoria, it's almost like a suburb. And at the moment, low density living is very important to people. People don't want to be clustered in high rise.
So how about Manhattan luxury? What are your views there, Seth?
So Manhattan luxury is frankly a bloodbath at the moment. There is just an incredible amount of luxury inventory. And I use the sort of word luxury in quotations because there's true luxury, irreplaceable locations, impeccable construction quality. And then there's a lot of projects that have branded themselves as luxury, but really are in secondary or tertiary submarkets within Manhattan and don't have the same level of execution and construction quality. Those projects are suffering. I mean, there are over 300 projects in New York City at the moment that have not reached their 15% sales threshold to declare their condos effective. Of those, there are 94 that already have their temporary certificate of occupancy or their certificate of occupancy, meaning that they're ready to be occupied and lived in, but they haven't reached a critical sales threshold. So, what you see is a lot of supply. It's going to take many years to absorb that supply, and that has, put a lot of downward pressure on pricing.
What about hotels?
Now, hotels is an area that we don't focus on. It's actually the one asset class that we don't invest in. But it is impacted by similar dynamics that we are seeing in other parts of the market, and obviously tourism is a big part of that. There are just not people visiting New York. The reasons people visit New York at the moment are effectively suspended. So people don't, if you can't eat in the restaurants, if you can't go to the Broadway shows, if you can't participate in the culture that draws the world to Manhattan or to New York City, then you're not going to come. And obviously that's a bad thing for hotels, and the business traveler is also not coming. So at the moment, there's almost no demand.
As a Broadway junkie and as someone who's been in maybe 13 theatrical performances myself, I've been heartbroken to not have Broadway open the last year. It's a huge part of New York that makes it very special, and it's just a gigantic amenity that's disappeared.
Absolutely, and it's also a major employer. And the creative community in particular, which is a vital part of the city and the fabric of the city, has been hit really hard. And there's going to need to be a lot of effort to make sure that those participants, can come back from this.
It's amazing how quick it is to drive through Times Square right now, whereas it used to always be a traffic bloodbath.
It's eerie.
Ghost town, yes, eerie indeed. So do you think that New York bottoms and recovers? And if so, when do you see a bottom coming?
I do. I think I'm a long-term believer in New York. I think if you look at where the world is today versus where it was in October, you have a lot of reasons to be optimistic. I mean, first and foremost, you have a vaccine that is being distributed. Second, regardless of one's politics, I think most people can agree that having a majority leader in the Senate from New York is helpful in terms of bringing federal dollars to New York. I think those two things are great long-term for the city. Additionally, when you look at the big employers, there have been some really interesting leases signed. You've seen Facebook take 750,000 square feet at the Farley Post Office. Amazon continues to build out its physical footprint, not at the scale that was planned, but they're still making investments. Disney's, several million square foot office headquarters downtown is under construction. Same with Google. TikTok has signed a lease. So you've seen a lot of big companies that are thriving who have long-term 10, 20, 30-year outlooks, and they're investing in New York City, right? Google wouldn't be spending billions of dollars building a new campus if they didn't believe in the city. The biggest risk to New York right now, in my view, are the local elected officials, the city council, the state legislature that continue to sort of chase the business community away. That is a significant risk. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but to me, long term, there are some positive dynamics, but certainly there are some risks.
Last question. Lincoln Center to the Plaza has generally been one of the most expensive, kind of boulevards in Central Park South, boulevards in New York City. And, then Central Park West, the low 60s, are one of the most elite places to live. Do you see that area of New York continuing to be the ultra elite, or do you kind of see it shifting downtown maybe?
I think it depends on the demographic you're targeting. I mean, if you look at some of the big downtown towers, particularly on Fifth Avenue in the 20s, you've had a couple sort of Starkitect buildings that have not sold well. And that's because they were really targeting international buyers, a lot of Chinese buyers. That money has dried up. It's not easily able to leave those countries. Those people are not traveling to New York. So those markets that have drawn international funds, I think that's going to be a struggle for the next certainly couple of years. I think the core areas where wealthy New Yorkers live,
yeah,
that will remain, right? There's
Lincoln Center, Park Avenue, those are
those are people who really typically live here or are New Yorkers. Now we've seen a lot of people, high income taxpayers, leave the city, right? They might keep an apartment here, but they've moved to more tax-friendly locations, and that is a serious problem. But until there's an adjustment in tax policy, I think people are going to continue to spend time outside the city because the taxes in New York State are, I think, the second highest in the country. You layer on top of that New York City taxes as well as proposed increases. People have a real motivation to consider alternate places to live, particularly when they can still keep an apartment in New York.
Awesome, Seth.
And to add to that, one more thing is, our funds, we manage capital on behalf of family offices, foundations, and ultra high net worth individuals. And what we've seen consistently is a lot of those family offices, the high net worth individuals, where their K1 goes, and I think Alex, you can relate to this. The number of K1s where they've changed the addresses from New York to Florida in the last, it's a trend like this. And
yes, I'm hoping that trend will change sometime soon. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, 7th generation. Couldn't imagine living anywhere else. So it's tough for me. My heart lies in the city. So.
Yeah, I want to see New York thrive too, but
a lot of options.
Capital is mobile, it's global, and it doesn't necessarily need to be here. I mean, I think we need to create an environment that doesn't ostracize success and demonize it. I think we need to create an environment that encourages business and entrepreneurship and does it in a way that allows everybody to participate.
Well said, Seth. Fantastic. You're brilliant and you're kind and you're fantastic. I really appreciate you having me.
Well, thank you for having me.